2020 presidential candidate and former governor of Massachusetts, Bill Weld, to Lowell High. He's going to speak about his experiences and also what it's like running for president. He began his career in public service as a staffer on the House Judiciary Committee. He was an attorney, U.S. attorney for Massachusetts, and then also in the Department of Justice, before being elected to 2 terms as governor of Massachusetts. When he ran for re-election, he won by the largest margin in Massachusetts history, still. So an overwhelming re-election in the Commonwealth. He's currently campaigning here and in Vermont in preparation for Super Tuesday next week. And you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from him, so I'm going to turn it over, and thank you, Governor Weld, for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Kraft. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. I am Bill Weld, and this is my wife, Leslie, in blue, who's a killer investigative reporter for the Washington Post for many years and now a novelist. So watch what you say. You might wind up in a novel. And we are both thrilled to be here. I think I'm just going to talk for 10 or 12 minutes and then see if you all have questions of any kind. I learn a lot more when I keep my mouth shut than when it's open. But I want to tell you how my career in public life started. It was a somewhat circuitous route. I was sitting in the law library in law school, and a classmate of mine came up and said, "You look bored." I said, "I am bored." I was preparing for my civil procedure exam, and it was very boring. And he said, "Well, you know what you should do is go into the State House in Boston," law school was in Cambridge, "and volunteer work for a state representative. There's a guy there called Marty Linsky, and he's kind of a moderate Republican like us." I knew this guy through a political group. I said, "Okay." So I went in the next day. I'm a native of Long Island, New York, so I walked into this guy's office and said, "Hi, my name is Billy Weld." And he said, "Lose the black shoes and also lose that New York Times under your arm. It gives you, it's a dead giveaway. You'll never pass in the State House otherwise." I was okay. So I stopped wearing black shoes forever. In Boston, it's brown shoes. And I started carrying the Boston Globe under my arm instead of the New York Times. And he gave me some equally boring work to do, analyzing various relocation housing bills. It was getting on to the end of the year, so I went in to finish up this work on a very hot afternoon in June. And outside the State House, there was a full-scale anti-war, anti-Vietnam War rally going on. And everybody was hula hoops and shorts and T-shirts. They were having a wonderful time. And I'd put on a 3-piece suit to come in and finish my work up on the 5th floor of the State House, which at that point had no air conditioning. So it's just sweltering. Sweat was running down my face. And I looked out the window. Everyone was having such a good time. I said, "No, I better stay here and finish this." So I stayed 3 more hours, finished the analysis of these very boring bills, left it on Marty Linsky's desk, and he was running for lieutenant governor that next year, so I knew he had a future. And I went back to Cambridge, and when I arrived there, the subway station was in flames. It was the height of the anti-Vietnam War protests and rallying and that sort of thing. So I walked back to the place where I lived in Cambridge, and I said, "Maybe I'm just getting something wrong here. Those folks looked like they were having a really good time at that rally. And here I am in this stupid 3-piece suit with the sweat running down my face, and I don't know what this is all about." So I go to work in a law firm in Boston. 3 years later, phone rings. It's Marty Linsky. He said, "Well, Congressman Tom Railsback from Illinois just called me. He's on the House Judiciary Committee, and they're looking for some sane Republicans to come down there and work for the committee." Translation, not rabid right-wingers. So I said, "Oh, Marty, thank you so much for thinking of me, but I got to stay here 7 years because it takes 7 years to become a partner, and I got to do that just because that's what people do." He said, "Oh, okay, thought I'd ask." So I hang up, and I stare at the telephone, and sweat begins to run down the back of my head, and I realized I've made a terrible mistake. So I said, and I was sure he'd already given away the job. So I call him instantly. I said, "Marty, I assume you've got somebody else for that, but I've changed my mind." And he said, "No, not at all." So he sent me to Washington. I got the job. I went to work on the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. This was 1973-74. I was advised by all my father's friends, don't take the job. Nixon just won 49 states in the last election, which was against George McGovern. And, this is going to fizzle out. It's going to amount to nothing. I said, "Nah, I think I'll do it." So I hung around, and so it turned out to be a very interesting case, the Watergate case. And a lot of the Republicans on the committee said, oh, no, there's not enough evidence that Mr. Nixon knew about this effort to kill the Watergate investigation. And other people said he's stone cold guilty. We're going to get him out of there. It's kind of like the impeachment of Mr. Trump just very recently. So I watched all these Republicans undergo the draining effort of defending the president. And then 3/4 of the way through, the famous Watergate tapes become public because the U.S. Supreme Court orders President Nixon to turn over the tapes. So they turn over the tapes, and instantly Nixon is gone. Barry Goldwater, who's a famous Republican senator, a presidential nominee in the past, goes to see him with the leaders in the House and the Senate and said, Mr. President, you have lied to me for the last time. Because, of course, Nixon had been telling everybody, I knew nothing about this. You've lied to me for the last time. You now have no support in the United States Senate. All of the senators are just horrified that you actually lied to the American public when you said you didn't know about this, and you're gone. And he was gone within a week. Nixon was gone. But that whole thing was very exciting. It was like one big criminal investigation. So I got interested in criminal law, and I switched from corporate department into the litigation department, which means courtroom work, in my law firm. And later in that decade, I run for state attorney general because I'm interested in criminal investigations. And I lose very badly to Frank Bellotti, who was the incumbent and a great guy, became a lifelong friend of mine and law partner right now as we speak. But I liked that experience, even though I lost very badly. And then the next year, Ronald Reagan gets elected president of the United States. So he has to find somebody to be the U.S. attorney for Massachusetts. The U.S. attorney is the chief federal lawyer and has both criminal jurisdiction to go after the bad guys and prosecute them, and also civil jurisdiction, which is non-criminal cases or garden variety court cases. So I do that, and on the civil side, I filed a lawsuit against the state to compel the cleanup of Boston Harbor, which at that point was the second dirtiest harbor in the world after Rotterdam. And on the criminal side, I made public corruption cases, people stealing from the public, my number one priority. And I charged 111 criminal cases of public corruption, and we got. I was very careful about putting the cases together, and we got convictions either by jury trial or guilty plea in 110 out of the 111 cases. And that's a semi-unheard of ratio. So that got some attention. And then I was sent down to Washington to be head of criminal cases for the whole country, and that attracted some notice. And then when I came back, I ran for governor on the strength of the publicity from those things, and I won very narrowly. I started out sub-asterisk, meaning with no support whatsoever, but then ultimately did win narrowly, and that's how I became governor. Point of story: do little things well and somebody will notice. Because I did the analysis of these relocation housing bills, boring as they were, to finish and follow through on my undertaking to Marty Linsky to help him out with this research. And so when Tom Railsback called him, he called me, and that was my entire career in public life. Stem back to that stupid volunteer work it wasn't stupid, but the volunteer work that I was doing. And really, it would never have happened. I would never have gone into litigation. I would never have gone into criminal law. I would never have become U.S. attorney, and I would never have gotten elected. And so, I think it's great advice for students. I was past that stage at that point, but it's great advice that just focus on the little things, and it doesn't matter if somebody's watching. Eventually, you'll do a good job with something, and somebody will be watching. So in terms of my time as governor here, I spent a lot of time in the city of Lowell. My press secretary, Ray Howell, during the campaign and when I became governor, was from Lowell. And I became friendly with a guy named Ed Davis, who was the chief of police in Lowell at that point. He went on to become chief of police in Boston. He's now got his own consulting firm, very eminent guy. But he pioneered community policing and bicycle policing, and became famous for all that. And so I spent a lot of time here, love the neighborhood, spent a lot of state money to revamp things in Lowell, and I'm proud to be in Lowell High, and I now have the tie to prove that I'm an honorary graduate of Lowell High, and so thank you for that. So that takes me up almost to the present, and I can tell you more about why I'm running for president and all that, but I think maybe I'll stop here and see if you all have questions of any sort for me, and I'll give it my best swing. Yeah, the question is, what was it like being a Republican governor in a very Democratic state? So I knew if I was confrontational at all, I'd be a dead letter, because the Republicans were outnumbered by the Democrats 4-1. So the first week I'm in office, I call up the Senate President, the famous Billy Bulger, and the House Speaker, Charlie Flaherty, and I walk down the hall to their offices to show that I'm not pulling rank, I'm making the submissive gesture. I say, why don't we get together for coffee and crackers every Monday afternoon, just social, not legislative meeting, not business, just shoot the breeze. So we do that, and my theory was, if you're going to have a social meeting with somebody sometime during the next 7 days, it's harder to tell the press that they're a jerk or stab them in the back, and it proved out to be true. And that was so successful in ushering in a golden era of cooperation between the Democrats and the Republicans that the current governor and lieutenant governor and the Speaker and the Senate President do the same thing every Monday afternoon to this day. So we avoided all the poisonous opposition between the Republicans and the Democrats in Washington. And I'm here to tell you they are wasting so much of our taxpayers' money by just shooting at each other all the time that it's a tragedy. It's one of the reasons why I ran for president, because Washington clearly is not plugged in. But thank you for the question. What makes me think I would be a better president than Mr. Trump? A better candidate to beat Trump? Well, I'm running against him as a Republican. I'm not one of the Democrats, so it's quite a different angle. When I'm talking about why I'd be better as a Republican, I generally say that I'm an economic conservative. When I was in office as governor, I was ranked the most fiscally conservative, which means don't spend the people's money, governor in the country. And my motto was, there's no such thing as government money, there's only taxpayers' money. And nobody in Washington understands that. They all think it's their money, and they can spend as much as they like, which is why they have trillion-dollar deficits every year. And unless that's stopped, that's a gun aimed at your generation's head, because we're going to run out of money. In fact, when I came into office as governor, the state was bankrupt. I followed 3 fairly free-spending terms. My friend and another law partner, Mike Dukakis, was the outgoing governor. But he said in 1990, my election year, that the state could no longer pay its bills. They've been spending too much money. That can happen at the federal level, because ultimately, even though they have a printing press in Washington, if they keep printing the money and there's nothing behind it, nobody's going to respect that paper, and you're going to be relying on the Chinese and other countries to come belly up to the ticket window and buy our treasury bills. And if they don't, there'd be no money to pay for Social Security and social programs for you all. So your generation should take that one very, very seriously. And that's one of my claims, which is an accurate claim, is that I'm an economic conservative, and Mr. Trump is not, because he's spending $1 trillion a year more than he's taking in. So that's the argument on the Republican side. On the other hand, and that would also distinguish me from the Democrats, because they particularly Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, they like to spend a lot more money than people are taking in, and they like to raise taxes to pay for their programs. And I actually cut taxes 21 times and never raised them, which is why, as was indicated, I got 71% of the vote when I was running for re-election. So that's the major distinction. The question is, if I don't win the presidency, would I want to be a member of the cabinet? Not under Mr. Trump. Excuse me? Oh. So I think Mr. Trump is kind of a danger to the country, and he says often, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to have elections? And then he says he's kidding, but I think he really doesn't want to have elections. And he says things like a free press is the enemy of the people, and independent judiciary is a threat to the people. That's what Mussolini and Hitler and Joe Stalin said on their way up to the top of their respective countries. So I would never support Mr. Trump for any office, nor would I want to be in his cabinet. And I think I may be getting a little long in the tooth. The same age Mr. Trump is, but 60 pounds lighter and a little taller. But I'm getting a little long in the tooth to go back into government. So I had three stints in Washington. I worked in the Senate for Senator Javits of New York. I worked for the House in the House Judiciary Committee on the impeachment of Nixon. And then I was Assistant Attorney General of the United States in charge of the criminal division that has worldwide jurisdiction. And I've probably seen enough of Washington. But if a nice Democrat got in and said, you have to come help me, your country calls you, I suppose it's possible.
You said that you differentiate yourself from Mr. Trump as a fiscal conservative. Are there no other issues in which you would differentiate?
Oh no, Mr. Trump is a train wreck in terms of issues. So I think he's doing everything upside down and backwards. One of the main ones is climate change. I've been a lifelong environmentalist, and as I said, the first thing I did as U.S. Attorney was sue the state to compel the cleanup of Boston Harbor under the federal Clean Water Act, which was actually passed under Mr. Nixon, a Republican. And then in my first term as governor, I cleaned up all the rivers in the state, and I was so pleased with having done that when we were celebrating the passage of the Rivers Protection Act, I was standing on some pontoons near the MIT boathouse in Cambridge, and I dove into the river to prove how clean all the rivers were. And the Charles River was a complete dump when I was going to school there. You would never have gone near it voluntarily. But so I dove in, and that's the only thing that most people in Massachusetts can remember me doing during my 2 terms as governor, was diving into the river. And what happened, actually, the river was only 16 inches deep there, so I went right to the bottom, but it was a nice flat dive, so it looked okay. But what nobody knew was that a storm had come through the previous night and churned up the bottom of the river, which releases all the fecal coliform bacteria, which are otherwise embedded in the river bottom. And I couldn't hear out of my left ear for 3 weeks. But I couldn't tell anybody that because, there's such a thing in politics as stepping on the story. You don't want to say something that's going to distract the public from the point you're trying to make. It's known as stepping on your own story. So I had to keep my stopped up left ear to myself for 3 weeks. But anyway, long story short, environmental protection is a long suit of mine and a great interest. And the granddaddy of all environmental protection issues is climate change. And the science is very clear that unless we reduce the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere, that polar ice cap up by the North Pole is going to melt, and all the coastlines of every country all over the world, no more East Coast, no more West Coast, they're going to be under 45 feet of water. Those of you who live 30 miles inland, you may have shorefront property, but anyone who's on the shore right now is going to be way underwater. So it's going to be a complete disaster for the world, and it's going to usher in catastrophic weather conditions such as nobody has ever imagined prior to this. So Mr. Trump has a one-word slogan, one-word platform for climate change and the danger of the ice cap melting. He says hoax. It's not possible. It can't happen. Well, 2,000 scientists testified that it absolutely is going to happen unless we can get carbon out of the atmosphere. And we just have to put it to the coal companies and the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, natural gas companies, the mining companies. They're the major polluters. They're the major emitters of carbon into the atmosphere. So we got to tell them, you're going to have to pay $50 a ton for every ton of carbon you put into the atmosphere. And beyond a certain point, they're not going to want to do that. It'll be too expensive. And that's the only way to make sure that the temperature won't go up and cause the ice cap to melt. It's not enough simply to say, as some Democrats do, again, making a distinction between Democrats and Republicans. Some of the Democrats say, we love wind and solar, or we're going to spend $16.3 trillion fighting climate change. That's Bernie Sanders. But he doesn't say, I'm going to put a tax or a fee on carbon. He says, I'm not convinced about this, about the ice cap melting. I haven't been persuaded, but I'm going to spend $16.3 trillion. It's like families in which, love is expressed through food. In some of the Democratic candidates, love and passion are expressed through how much money they can spend. And the more, the better, particularly in Senator Sanders' case. So, there are differing approaches here, but the only way really is to put a price on carbon. And that's another issue aimed at your generation's head, because it's not going to trouble me when in the middle years of this century, all the coastlines are under 47 feet of water, but it's going to trouble you a great deal. So I consider both of these generational issues, and they're signature issues of my campaign. And people point out correctly that Mr. Trump has enormous support among rank and file Republicans. They like his sort of non-political correctness. And actually, he was kind of an entertaining, even refreshing candidate in 2016. It's only since he got in office and we see what awful decisions he makes that I think his true colors have begun to show. But I can understand how he got elected. When there were 12 Republicans up there on the platform in the 2016 cycle, he did stand out as being the best pivoter and debater and the most entertaining. I mean, he had a career in reality TV, so he was pretty good at that stuff. But so he has this popularity, and so my task really is to make sure that more people come and vote in the Republican primary than usual. And it would make no sense for me to go to the Republican state committees and say, can I please have your support? Because this year, you may know this, the Republican National Committee, which runs the party nationwide, merged its operation with the Trump campaign. So now I would be knocking at the door of the Trump campaign itself saying, can you help me out? And not bloody likely, since I'm running against him. But so I want to get more different people voting in the Republican primary. There are 24 states where independents or independents and Democrats are allowed to come in and vote in the Republican primary, or vice versa. Republicans could vote in the Democratic primary in many of those states, and independents in all cases. Those are called crossover states or open primaries. 24 of them. Massachusetts is one, New Hampshire is one, Vermont is one, Michigan is one. So I'm focusing on those states because I think I have a better shot. My political persona is seen as somewhat centrist because I'm a fiscal conservative and a social liberal. And that passes for centrist somehow. And what happened when I got reelected was I got only about 50% of the Republican vote in the election, but then the independents, who are the most numerous category in Massachusetts, about 50% of all voters in those days, came in and voted for me by a 6-to-1 majority. So that has to be my strategy this time, try and get those independents in the crossover states to come in and vote for me. And there are two major categories where I hope to bring in more people. One is younger voters, millennials and Gen Xers. And I make the point that there are these two generational issues, the budget deficits and the climate change, which should make them more interested in my positions than the positions of Mr. Trump. The other issue is women. And I don't mean just moderate suburban women. I mean all women. I think the Republicans in Washington do a lot of things, particularly in areas such as reproductive choice, telling women, big guys 2,000 miles away from you are going to tell you how to make the decision whether you're going to have a child or not. I just find that impossible to buy. So I say, it's the chattel theory of women, back to the Middle Ages, back to the Stone Ages practically. So I'm trying to interest women in the idea that their freedoms and their liberty are being encroached on by the Republicans who are down there now, and they should vote for me instead. We'll see how that comes out, but that's very much part of the politics behind this year's election. Oh, I went to Harvard Law School in Cambridge. So I was in Cambridge for a long time, undergraduate and law school. And my wife and I finally escaped 4 years ago, and we moved to Canton. We live inside the Great Blue Hills Wildlife Refuge. It's a state wildlife refuge. So all of our neighbors are either coyotes or snakes or ticks or deer and many, many turkeys. It's really great. And the turkeys eat the insects, but we're not allowed to shoot anything, so we wouldn't want to anyway. We wouldn't want to kill Bambi. But so we finally, I grew up in the woods in Long Island, New York, and so I finally returned to the woods. My views on immigration. Immigration is one of the issues where I think Mr. Trump is at his least appealing. You may remember that shortly after the election, he began railing against Muslims. We hate Muslims. Then right after that, it was Hispanics. We hate Hispanics. Everybody should hate Hispanics. I, Donald Trump, I'm for America first, and I'm an isolationist. I've never heard any politician admit to being an isolationist before. And he says, and I'm a nationalist. Charles de Gaulle, who's a former president of France, said that a nationalist is someone for whom the most important thing, Hitler was a nationalist. Matter of fact, the Nazi party is the same as the word nationalism. And de Gaulle, who of course hated Hitler, he led the French resistance during the Second World War. He said a nationalist is someone for whom the most important thing is hatred of other peoples. And a patriot is someone who loves his own people and his own country. And I think de Gaulle had it absolutely right. And my perception, and I can't prove this, but my perception is that Mr. Trump wishes to stir up resentment among and between racial groups and economic groups to get everybody's teeth on edge and get everybody feeling bad about the United States and feeling that someone else must be getting ahead of them. It's almost when he says the Mexicans, the Mexicans, they're all rapists and murderers, which he absolutely said, word for word. It's designed to make anyone who loses a job feel that they've lost it to someone who just crawled through the mud across the Mexican border, who took their job and now is about to start harassing their wife, which is why he said that thing. And, it's the opposite of what a president should do. A president should be the chief executive officer of the country and should be looking out for absolutely everybody, for all groups and all individuals. I like to say that my idea of a well-functioning democracy is a place where the individual can never be thrust in a corner. My perception about Mr. Trump is that he rather delights in thrusting individuals and groups into a corner. So it just drives me nuts. In the last cycle, I ran in the Libertarian Party for vice president. I was the Libertarian Party candidate for vice president. So my politics in general is that individual liberties and individual rights should generally always prevail over assertions of government power. I'm somewhat wary about government power. So I'm the opposite of a statist. And all that, the immigration issue figures very prominently in that. Also, as an economic matter, we need more immigrants, not fewer, in order to staff up the construction industry and the agriculture industry, particularly in the western half of the United States, where I spent a lot of time in the last cycle. You cannot populate the construction industry during peak season out west without people coming in over the border from Mexico. Legally, illegally, it doesn't matter. Same in the agriculture industry. And a lot of people do come from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, and they kind of follow the crops. And they are up in North America, including Canada, for 4 or 5 months. They send remittances back to their families in Central America or Mexico, Mexico being part of North America. And then they go back to their families because that's where they want to be. They don't want to live in the United States. And the whole notion that there are 11 million illegal aliens, so-called, not undocumented immigrants, but illegal aliens, to sound as terrible as possible, living in our midst, who all want to be citizens tomorrow without waiting in line like everybody else, that's a complete myth made up by Mr. Trump. And we need more work visas to do the work, construction and agriculture. Also in the Northeast, tourism is big business, and we need more immigrants to work in that industry. People are not willing. It is literally impossible to find Americans to fill all the jobs in the tourism industry. So even the Northeast has some skin in this game. But so we need more of those visas. Even for people graduating from college, the most brilliant Chinese student graduates first in her class from MIT, and what do we tell her? Go back to China. We're educating our competition. We'd be much better off taking advantage of the brilliance and the energy of people who come here to live and study. And the reason everybody wants to come to the United States is because they know that we have, at least historically, the rule of law here. And I've traveled all over the world the last 15 years in the private sector, no public office whatsoever, and seen business all over the world. I'm doing consulting and legal work around the world. Everybody wants to invest in the United States. People want to live in the United States because we've got something historically that nobody else has, which is an ironclad devotion to the rule of law. Meaning we've got a written constitution, we've got a whole bunch of written statutes, and they say what the law is, and those rules predominate over what any one individual says. And that is not the case elsewhere in the world. For example, there's this huge contest now between India and China about who's going to be number 2 and who's going to win the most jobs there. And India can say, we have the rule of law because we had the British system. And China cannot convincingly say, we have the rule of law, because they're absolutely, I love a lot of things about China, but it is absolutely one person saying what the law is going to be there, and that's Xi Jinping. So the rule of law is the reason why they call Boston the shining city on a hill, and why everyone wants to come to the United States. And in my judgment, and bear in mind I was a high-ranking official in the Justice Department, Mr. Trump has difficulty conforming his conduct to any requirements of law or social mores or norms of any kind. In fact, he was well known for being almost a scofflaw in his housing business in New York earlier on in his career. And recently, he's been intervening in criminal cases with no authority to do so. If we're going to have a government of laws and not of men and women. So he's really undermined that, and that's another reason why I'm running against Mr. Trump in the primary. I want to prevent him from undermining the rule of law in our government, our democratic institutions, or else we're not going to have a democracy any longer. And, it does happen that as my wife's old employer, the Washington Post says, democracies die in darkness. And my perception is that we're under threat in that department right now, and entirely too many people, including 52 United States senators I could name, who voted to acquit Mr. Trump of very obvious malfeasance on his part, based on no evidence whatsoever. So I think we're in some danger there, and it's why my wife and I decided a year ago that I had to make this race and draw these sharp distinctions, even though Mr. Trump did have 95, 97% popularity among registered Republicans. I wanted to run this time as a Republican, not a Libertarian, because I wanted that direct shot, that direct contrast with Mr. Trump. So the political parties do change, and you know, for many years, Franklin Roosevelt put together a coalition of Southern Democrats and Northern liberals. And the Democrats were not liberal at all, but they became part of this coalition that FDR put together. And Nixon and Spiro Agnew in the 1968 election decided to run on a law and order platform, and they were very tough. And eventually, they used to speak in terms of the solid South, meaning solidly Democratic in presidential elections. And Nixon was pretty smart about politics, and so he ran on this law and order platform. And little by little, they peeled away the Southerners who were bad about race. They were not friendly to dark-skinned people. So they became more and more attracted to the Republican Party. And now most of your, unfortunately, racist members of Congress from the South are Republicans. So things do change. And in the 1850s, shortly before the Civil War, one of the two great parties was called the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. And it split in two on the issue of slavery. And there was a Southern faction called the Know Nothing Party, which was so called because if they were asked whether they had secret meetings, they were supposed to say, "I know nothing." And the Southern faction was pro-slavery, and it was founded on anti-immigrant prejudice, anti-immigrant fervor. And in that case, of course, it wasn't Muslims. We barely knew there was such a thing as Muslims. It was Catholics. It was Catholics coming in from Ireland and Italy and Germany. And these people despised the immigrants. So this didn't all start with Donald Trump. And the Know Nothing Party had violent rallies, and they were very much given to conspiracy theories. These are the three distinguishing features of the Know Nothing Party. Sound familiar? So anyway, they're the direct forebear of the Trump faction of today's Republican Party. And the other side, the Northern faction, of course, was against slavery, and they joined the Free Soil Party in the 1856 election, and then went on 4 years later to found the Republican Party and elect Abraham Lincoln. So I think something like that could be going to happen quite soon. And I think just as all those people who defended President Nixon in 1974 and said, oh no, there's not enough evidence that he knew about this, they looked like idiots when those tapes came out, the Watergate tapes, and they all lost their seats, even the ones who had been winning easily. And I think a bunch of those Republicans who said in the Senate, who said this year, we don't want to hear any evidence, we're just going to acquit the president because we're just going to do it. And we don't want to hear any evidence, even though the Constitution says the Senate shall hold a trial. So those people clearly violated their oath under the Constitution. And I think a bunch of them deserve to lose their seats and will lose their seats. And so the Republicans will lose the Senate. So you're going to see a bunch of finger pointing there. And I think it's entirely possible that that the Trump faction of the Republican Party could get a little bit smaller, and so the equivalent of the Northern, the old Republicans who were created in 1858, they'll be the nucleus of a new party, which could include some libertarians and could include some fiscally conservative Democrats, centrist Democrats, not the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warren. They'll be over with the current Democratic Party, but the present Republican Party under Trump could, or even after Trump is gone, could become smaller to the point where it's even marginalized, and maybe the combination of the old nice people from the Republican Party and the Libertarians could become a third party. So I think it would not be unhealthy for business if there grew up a viable third party here. When Gary Johnson, who was a colleague of mine as Republican governor of New Mexico, and I ran last time, we came very close to getting 5% of the popular vote, and that would have given us majority party status, meaning that we would not have had to go through a lot of rigmarole to get on the ballot in all 50 states, and that would be a three-party system. which is not unheard of. They have it in both Canada and the United Kingdom, or have for some time. The Liberal Party in England was the #2 party, and within my lifetime, the Labour Party just ran right past them, and something similar has happened in Canada. So that kind of switch can happen in 10 years, and I think it's coming. So interesting question.
Following the last train of thought that you were talking about, if it is Bernie Sanders against Trump, would you consider running as a libertarian again?
No, I wouldn't want to run the risk of diluting the anti-Trump vote and helping Mr. Trump. Last time we could be pretty certain that the libertarian vote was going to come from Mr. Trump, because when you think about it, a libertarian vote is either a protest vote or a change vote, and neither one of those votes was about to go to Hillary Clinton.
Okay, that makes sense. Your position on term limits is very unusual. Why do you think term limits would be a good idea for Congress?
Well, these people get there and they think God elected them after a couple of terms, and they stop thinking. We need the ferment of new ideas in Washington, and turnover helps that. I can't imagine why anyone would want to serve, 4 terms in the Senate. That's a lifetime. And, the graveyards are full of indispensable people, and the same can be said of Congress.
Well, in a very brief way, can you give us an idea of why you decided to run for president this year?
Well, I think Mr. Trump is too autocratic on his domestic policies, and he's divisive on purpose I think, so as to soften up the citizenry and, pave the way for him to assume autocratic powers. And internationally, I think he's tilting far too much in the direction of Russia, almost pushing Eastern Europe back into the Russian orbit. And he has no understanding of the need for nuclear non-proliferation. He seems to be going in the other direction, ripping up nuclear treaties with Russia and encouraging Japan and South Korea to develop their own nuclear weapons programs. He doesn't understand that if we have too many countries with nuclear weapons, it'll get increasingly difficult to keep the nuclear peace. And you know what that means? World War III. I think the man's a threat.
Can you tell me just very briefly what you would do to support the Affordable Care Act?
Well, I think we should recognize that the Affordable Care Act added 20 million people to the rolls of the insured, which helps a lot on lowering costs. I think we should allow people to build up their own medical savings accounts, health savings accounts, by just like a retirement plan. So withdraw money on a tax-free basis, put it into this account, storing up nuts against the winter so that people would have their own cushion in the event of exigent or emergency health situations anywhere in their family. I also think we should allow people to buy health insurance across state lines and allow people to buy prescription drugs from Canada. With a heavy heart, I must say I've changed my mind on the issue of allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices. I finally lost patience with Big Pharma, and I think we should give Medicare that power.
And what happens for people who can't afford to have a savings account for medical expenses?
Well, they'd be covered as now under the Affordable Care Act, and we have to preserve the provisions of that act regarding pre-existing conditions to avoid unfairness.
And do you think that Republicans in Congress are really that anti-ACA, or do you think it's just a stance? Because they don't seem to have another idea.
Yeah, no, even the Republicans who say repair and replace have no idea what they want to replace it with. So I think it's just a political stance, and I think most of those people have probably not taken advantage of the opportunity to learn what's in the act. It's pure politics.
Okay, and one more question. Do you know about the threats to public access television and the importance of public access, and are you at all concerned that it might go away? Public access television, supported by the cable franchise fees in each town. The FCC is threatening to undermine its funding source.
Oh, well, you mean the FCC under Mr. Trump?
Yes.
Oh, why does this not surprise me?
Yes.
He's anti-free speech.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's basically it, is you think he's just anti-free speech?
I do. I think he's anti-First Amendment.
Well, thank you so much.